Danniel, thanks for joining me. Danniel Ortner is here from the Pacific Legal Foundation. Charles Moscowitz, thanks for joining me, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. You have an article up here from the Pacific Legal Foundation website, Government Regulations for Social Media Companies That Censor Political Speech. No thanks.
That's right.
Now, Danniel, this is something that is really roiling a lot of people, including myself right now, that being censorship on Facebook and YouTube. Breitbart just did an article suggesting, and they got information from someone inside at Facebook, which indicate that Facebook is implementing a euphemistically called hate speech program that is similar to, and as is Google, that is similar to the social scoring going on in communist China. And that if you don't make the social score, you can have your site removed. And in fact, in the case of YouTube, they're removing a ton of sites, including temporarily this site. My site was pulled down over the weekend. I was off the air for 2 days.
Wow.
The 300 odd videos that I have just vanished. And, this is really a major issue here. It was restored because I demonstrated that the whole thing was a big misunderstanding.
Yeah, of course.
But nevertheless, it really led me to not trust YouTube because, after all, I'm posting these things. So what I've done is I've set up an alternative site. I created a website, charlesmoscowitz.com, and I'm posting my videos there through a paid service, that being Podomatic, which they can't take down as easily because it's a subscription. And I'm trying to set up alternatives in case this happens again.
I think that what you did is exactly right. I don't think we should avoid being outraged at Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. There is evidence that they're being hypocritical, that they're applying their standards inconsistently. I think that that's definitely there. But the problem is that people then go to call the government to act to force YouTube or Facebook or Twitter to allow speech that they don't want to allow on their platform. And that is problematic because Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, they are ultimately private companies running private platforms. It is their property, and the government can't come in and tell them you have to allow access to others that you don't want to have access to your platform. That's not the way the First Amendment works. The First Amendment applies to government action that says the government shall take no action respecting the freedom of speech, but it does not stop private companies. Quite the opposite. It actually protects them. It says, Facebook, YouTube, you have a First Amendment right to exclude speech you don't want, to associate or not associate with whoever you want for practically any reason at all, or no reason.
Well, I mean, I agree with you on principle, and I agree with you philosophically, of course, as someone who is libertarian, as most Americans are, in a small L.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I mean, Google and YouTube, something else I discovered during this period of suspension, I looked into alternatives to YouTube, and I discovered that there really aren't any significant alternatives other than a couple of really kind of shady sort of sites. And that even so, none of them reach the level of presence that YouTube has, which is virtually monopolistic. I know that it's a private company, and I understand that, but it presents itself to the public, as does Facebook, as does Google, as what's the right word for it? A platform.
Kind of the authoritative place to go. Yeah, I mean, I think as an example, just last year, YouTube began demonetizing gun videos on their platform, and so gun enthusiasts started a separate website, live30.com, where they post gun-related videos. Just like you started your own website to host your own videos outside of the YouTube's space. Of course, you don't have the same reach that YouTube has, but there's no reason to think that there isn't competition. You can start a rival with YouTube, and you can slowly gain popularity and gain viewership. If YouTube keeps doing outrageous things and conservatives get upset, they can boycott and start their own platforms. and offer alternatives. That's happened with alternatives to Facebook. There are some conservative alternatives that have begun to get some traction. I've heard that President Trump might join one of these alternative platforms to Twitter or to Facebook, and then if that happens, then it'll explode, and there'll be a big burst of interest in it. If you look at social media, Google searching, there's about 12 alternatives that are different than Google with their privacy settings. They may not be as well known, they may not have the same reach, but the First Amendment doesn't guarantee you the right to have the most reach in your videos. It does guarantee the right of private companies to hold their views and to associate with who they want to associate ultimately.
Well, I mean, look, again, I'm very torn on this issue because I understand the privacy piece and that it is a private company. These alternatives to Google that you talk about, most of them still depend on Google for their the dissemination of their sites. So, it's not exactly independent.
Yeah, that's really true.
And that but it brings up, I mean, an issue of monopoly. Now, look, I think that ultimately you're right in that if they are going to suppress speech that they don't agree with, which is exactly what's going on here, there will be alternatives. They will come up. They'll probably compete with them, and they very well may put them out of business. I think George Gilder, who's a very respected journalist and writer, has written a book about this, and he claims that these companies are going to be dinosaurs. He says that they're not flying right in their censorship. But where it comes into a legal question, and again, this isn't an issue of government regulation, but they are presenting themselves publicly as a platform, not as a journalistic entity. This is something that was brought up by Steven Crowder, who has a huge website and who has just been demonetized because, according to YouTube, he made some kind of an insulting comment about somebody. Which seems to me to be just a fig leaf for covering up the fact that he expresses conservative opinions. Now, he says, and he has the resources, and he's got a legal team looking into it, that as long as YouTube it presents itself as a platform as opposed to as a journal, then they're discriminating against him and they're getting the benefits of being a platform and that they're not legally liable for anything that goes up on their site. Yeah. So they really can't, under that presentation, discriminate. If they want to present themselves as a journal, like the New York Times, then they can discriminate, of course, and decide what goes up on their site or not. So maybe he's splitting hairs here, but I think that what he's getting at is that they are benefiting from presenting themselves as an alleged vehicle for free speech, when in fact they're picking and choosing, and they're deciding that they don't like someone because they're too conservative.
That's right. So there's the Communications Decency Act, which Congress enacted. One of the sections of that act at the dawn of the internet basically said what you just said, that a platform for content, like a social media platform, is not held responsible for things like defamation. If I go on my Facebook account and I begin to defame you and I talk about, accuse you of a crime or something else, Facebook is not responsible for my private act of defamation. And there are many that have argued, some that I really respect, like Senator Ted Cruz and others, have said, well, we should change that so that if Facebook and others, if they're going to exercise any kind of editorial control, then they're not going to be given that protection. I think that that's a dangerous idea. I don't know that it violates the First Amendment, that it would be a constitutional problem, but I think as a matter of policy, it's a bad idea for a couple of reasons. One, that setup has led to the flourishing of the internet and to the growth of social media, which I think has been almost unquestionably a good thing for the world and for society. It's been a communications revolution. And so I think when you mess with the foundations, I think it's dangerous, and there are going to be consequences that we don't anticipate. One possibility might be that they'll just stop offering platforms for people to communicate and express themselves. That's what happened a couple of years ago with Craigslist. They have a personal ads section on Craigslist they used to have, where you could go and find someone to go on a date with or to hook up with. And this was a very popular part of their website. But then Congress said, well, sites like Craigslist are responsible if anything like trafficking happens, abuse of children, any bad consequences that happen as a result of these personal ads, they're liable. And immediately Craigslist shut down that section of their website. It's now no longer available to users that benefited or were using that platform. So I worry that if we change the Communications Decency Act and say, well, now you're responsible if anyone says something that is libelous or defamatory, that there's going to be a whole lot more heavy-handed censorship than you have now. It's going to be changed the way that platforms like Facebook and Twitter work. Despite some of their acts of censorship, these platforms are generally places for free dialogue, and they've been very successful at that for the most part. And I think they've led people to communicate with each other and to debate and deliberate ideas in a very beneficial fashion. So I worry that changing that will undermine and destroy what has existed and what has benefited society on the whole.
This is really interesting, because I actually think I disagree with this, in that if someone openly defames another person and makes a false accusation, like they say, so-and-so was seen drunk or something coming out of a bar, and it's not true or that it's not provable, then that's defamation and they should be held liable. And that sometimes with so-called trolling, I mean, you could put something up on the internet and it's not your real name, and it's hard to find the person that made the accusation. So I would think that there might be some liability there for Facebook or for YouTube. I mean, if somebody spreads an outright false lie about a specific person, that is libelous, isn't it? I mean, that's defamatory.
Yeah, I mean, it is for the person who posted it, but I think the idea that has held sway is that Facebook, creates space for people to have their own platforms. You can post whatever you want on Facebook, and you don't have censors, approving your post, looking at it and seeing is this appropriate or not. After the fact, they might take some content down, but they're not doing the kind of control that a editor of a journal would do, where every article is screened for content. And because of that, they create spaces for people to have debate and deliberate and express themselves, and therefore they're not responsible when someone maybe abuses that to say something defamatory. And that's really been the foundation of the success of Facebook and other similar sites.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, putting aside the defamation aspect, if I went ahead, and I'm sure if I went ahead right now and I did a video where I read portions of the Quran on the video and the Hadith and other elements of Islamic law, I would be pulled down. Now, that's not just opinion. I mean, or if I read something in the New Testament that questions homosexuality or transgenderism, I would be torn down. Now,
that's terrible.
Okay, this is where you're getting into opinion. And look, I've interviewed some of these people on the internet on the YouTube channels who are really anti-Semitic, and even though I abhor their opinions, I would argue that they have a right to be there, and I have a right to debate them and challenge them. I don't think the answer is to pull them down. Now, you've got interest groups now who are talking to YouTube, like the ADL and like CARE from the Islamic group, and some of these sort of pro-gay groups who are really saying you have to take this stuff down, and they're doing it.
I mean, well, I would push back on one thing you said, which is that you have a right to be there, because no one has a right to access to someone's private platform. Now, should Facebook or YouTube create space for debate and deliberation? Absolutely. I think society would be better off if YouTube and Facebook were really what they said they were, open places for people to go and to deliberate. When Facebook and YouTube don't live up to those ideas, we should call them out. We should consider boycotting them. We should consider criticizing them publicly, starting alternative channels for debate and deliberation. Absolutely. It really is sad and hypocritical if the YouTube claims that they want to create a space for dialogue, and then they're clamping down on deliberation and ideas. Debate is absolutely protected speech on the First Amendment, and the government could not censor it or prohibit it. But I think YouTube and Facebook are free to do so, but we are also free to criticize them. We should speak out and say this is hypocrisy. It's not not appropriate. We should say, well, we in this country need to value free speech, value ideas, deliberation, even when we offend each other, even when we disagree. We should be champions for free speech. We should stand up and say, they are wrong to do so. But the government should not be intervening and forcing them to do otherwise, because that's not the role for the government. Ultimately, that's the role for the market.
I find that I disagree with you partially here, right? In that these entities, particularly Google, which I think owns, or it's Facebook, which owns YouTube.
I think you're right. Google, I think, owns
Google does,
YouTube. Yeah. I think you're right the first time.
That they have become such a large piece of the public means of communication that they, in the de facto sense, are a monopoly. It's sort of like, like if there was one car maker in the United States, and they had regulations to shut out their competition. And so there are some law cases right now, and I'm sure you guys are probably against this, but speak for yourselves, that deal with antitrust, and that are questioning whether or not these companies have become a de facto monopoly and whether they should be busted. And of course, there's precedence for that going back to Teddy Roosevelt and the Sherman Antitrust Act when they busted the Rockefeller oil companies into 7 pieces.
Look, I don't know that Pacific Legal Foundation doesn't have a position on antitrust necessarily, but I personally would say that there are 2 kinds of arguments about antitrust. One is the view that some progressives have held, and Teddy Roosevelt might have held this, that if a company is big, too big, then that's already a reason to break them up, to do antitrust action. The other position, which was championed by Judge Robert Bork, is the most famous proponent in the antitrust sphere. He's kind of the most well-known intellectual in antitrust law. That is basically that a monopoly doesn't exist. Antitrust, there's no problem just because a company is large. The problem is only if they are harming consumers and creating barriers for other competitors to enter. And so the question for me is, what evidence is there that YouTube or Facebook or Twitter are engaging in anti-competitive behavior that blocks people from starting their own platforms, that makes it harder for them to do so? And if there's evidence for that, then I think you go after them and say that's an antitrust violation. But if the only complaint is they're too large, they have a big market share, then my response is the internet is free, it is fair, it is open, it is a fair market. You can start your competition. If you offer a better product, you can ultimately prevail. That's what happened with Facebook overtaking MySpace and others. And there's no reason to say that just because they're large, they're a monopoly. So I think I've heard that there's going to be a congressional investigation or several investigations into whether there has been anti-competitive actions, meaning are they shutting down competitors? Are they negotiating with each other to block out others from having a space on the visibility? If they're doing things like that, then I think you have an antitrust case. Otherwise, I don't think that's the kind of injury or the kind of action that really leads to antitrust violations or to a monopolistic dominance.
Well, it's not a matter of whether or not they're big or too big. It's a matter of whether or not their influence is so big that it dominates the market to the degree that it's probably over 95, 97, 98% of the market, which means that if you're not on Google and if you're not on YouTube, you're out of business. You can't function. We're against the idea of public ownership of the means of communication. That's a plank of communism. However, this is a de facto public ownership if you have this one group that owns virtually the means of communication. It would be like one group owning the telephone services or all cell phone services and deciding who gets to be on a cell phone. They may be a private company, but the fact is that this, in our society today, has become a very predominant means of communication. Now, whether or not they are engaging in, competitive shutting out competition, I think that you could make the case that they are, because every time a competitor comes up the pike, they buy them. If you take a look at what Facebook owns, I think they have a constellation of ownership over, as does Google, and I think those two. Maybe Twitter is like a smaller player, but between them, they all own everything. They seem to, at least in a de facto sense, collude with each other ideologically. Maybe not. I'm not saying they sit around a smoke-filled room somewhere, but they all seem to think alike, and that it has had a chilling effect. For example, this last congressional election, you had a shadow banning of conservative candidates. I don't even think that's controversial. There's been congressional testimony around that. And even the removal of Like, for example, Marsha Blackburn, senator from Tennessee, her site was shut down for 2 weeks just before the election. She won the election, but the point is that to suggest that this didn't influence the outcome of that election is very naive. Now, this went on across the board. Conservative candidates were shut down. Sites like Breitbart have reported that they have lost about a third of their share. Suddenly, it's like everything dropped off. They were growing and growing and growing, and all of a sudden it's dropped off. And other people, Sarah Palin, lost about a third of her Facebook following. That's not a coincidence if there's a pattern that can be shown, and I think there is a pattern. So
yeah, I agree.
I would suggest that this is monopolistic behavior.
I think that we need to see, are there any actual barriers to starting a competition, to starting an alternative? Are they doing anything to prevent that? Because otherwise, I think that really the option, the thing we should be doing is starting alternative platforms that are more friendly to conservatives, promoting them and getting people to go over there and taking away market share from Facebook. I think that's always the response if there's a free market, is competition and alternatives rather than government action. You mentioned, for instance, the monopoly over the phone lines that AT&T once had, and I think that was actually the government propped up the monopoly. They limited the ability for competitors to compete in the market through regulation, through colluding with these businesses. And I think right now we don't have that. We have an internet that is largely unregulated, and that's been to the benefit of innovation. If I go on my phone to the app store on my iPhone, I can download thousands or millions of different apps. You can find competitors to just about anything because anyone with a computer can code an app or create a website that is an alternative. And so I think when government begins to get involved, ultimately they do it in the name of antitrust or protecting consumers, but it's usually ultimately hurts consumers because it ends up leading to some kind of government collusion with these businesses. Facebook is calling for regulation, to regulate speech on the platform, for instance. And if the government did that, who would it benefit ultimately? It would benefit Facebook and others because the competitors would not be able to distinguish themselves by being more open to different ideas. So whenever you have these tech companies speaking out and saying, well, regulate us, limit our ability to do something, you really need to think, how is this benefiting them? Because they are the dominant players in a market. So I'm very skeptical generally of government action, of the consequences that are going to follow from it, and whether it would really lead to more free and fair competition than what exists today.
Well, I don't think that the answer is to have the government regulate the speech of these companies. The problem is that they're regulating their speech according to the modality that Google set up for Communist China. Communist China today has what's called a social score,
right?
And they derive that from what people do online. Everybody has a smartphone and or a laptop, more preferably a smartphone at this time. And if you get a lower social score in Communist China, you don't get to do certain things.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
And you could even get picked up. Nobody has firearms. The government has a monopoly on that, so they could just come in and kick your door down. Now,
yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. If you begin talking about the government using tools like that or colluding with social media to go after people or to monitor people, then I think that's really troubling. And there might be instances of that, but I think that's a reason to keep the government away ultimately from this space too.
Yeah, but that's exactly what Google's doing in this country. They're replicating that model that they developed for Communist China here. And they're working, I don't know if they're working with, but Facebook is doing the same thing. And they're monitoring people. If you, for example, Paul Joseph Watson, who, was kind of a slightly off-color, off-the-wall YouTube superstar, he's been completely removed because he interviewed this English guy who's against Islam in England. He was removed for that, and he didn't even interview him because he was in favor of it. I would like to interview him, but now I'm afraid to do it because I don't want to get pulled off. This is what I'm talking about here, and I would suggest that because of their huge footprint, that is a de facto. They're in a sense operating in the name of the government. They're not the government; they're private. But how can you raise the resources to compete with that when they have this enormous control over the public discourse? and that they can direct the public discourse in a way that views that they don't agree with are banned.
I would just disagree strongly with the idea that they are the equivalent of the government. Yes, they have a lot of market share and they're dominant, but I think that there is still a lot of room for competition for new players to start up. These companies that now are the dominant players have only been around for a very short period of time, relatively, and there's still a lot of room for competitors, for different ideas, for different platforms to take over if they're offering something better and offering more free space for more freedom and more free speech. I think that that'll be attractive to people that want that, and they'll be able to take over take market share from YouTube
if they can find out about it. I mean, I think that they are consolidating their control on the internet. I think the government wants them to do this. They've been talking about it for decades, and I think that time is short in terms of restoring and preserving some semblance of free speech on the internet. Anyways, Danniel, so what do you guys tell me about your case over there at Pacific Legal? What are you doing?
Oh, and with this area, right now we're just speaking out out on the issue.
Well,
I think the reason
you filed an amicus brief.
Oh yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's a case in the Supreme Court that touches indirectly on some of these issues. It's not a direct case about social media, but it's a case that they're going to be deciding any day now about television, a public interest television network, and whether they're required to provide access to everyone that goes on their channel. And we just wrote a brief kind of reemphasizing some of the principles I've talked about, which is that private companies remain private. They don't become state actors or government entities just because they're heavily regulated. The Second Circuit made a decision which said basically, because this network is heavily regulated and kind of resembles a public square, therefore they are a state actor, and the First Amendment applies to them, and they have to allow everyone to have access. And that's a very dangerous step. That could lead, private property owners like, shopping mall owners, for instance, to, they have something like a public square where people come and congregate and shop. And so this is even the case in California now, unfortunately, where, you have to open that up to anyone. It becomes an actual public square, and you can't exclude people. And that is very contrary to, I think, the First Amendment and also to the notion of private property rights. So hoping that this case, this case is a closer call in some ways, but the Second Circuit's opinion was so overly broad and dangerous, and so really hope the Supreme Court overturns the Second Circuit's opinion and really reemphasizes private property rights. Private property is private. Private property owners are not state actors. They're not government actors just because they're regulated, and they have the ability under the First Amendment to exclude people that they ultimately disagree with.
Okay. This is a very interesting and very complex subject.
Yeah.
Danniel Ortner from Pacific Legal Foundation, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
You too.